Hi, I'm Barry Seavey, and this is my walkthrough for my winter 2018 quarter project for Predict 454 Advanced Algorithms at Northwestern. The project I chose was from the drivendata.org webpage, specifically the Pump It Up competition. It's a predictive maintenance or predictive status project, so it's a classification. One unique factor about this is that it's a multi-class, so that's partly why I chose it. I've never done a multi-class prediction before. Another thing of note, it's an unbalanced data. Our target variable is not proportionate to the rest, but we'll get into that in a moment. First, a little background on it, the Tarifa organization and all the info from where this project is being derived. Here is the home page of the Driven Data describing the project here. See what they want to do is predict which pumps in Tanzania are functional, non-functional, or functional but still needs work. So if we go over to the next section about the group Tarifa, what they are is they're a separate group that they utilize an open source platform there to basically crowdsource their data gathering. So for all the people over there with these pumps all around the area for their water supply for their town, if there's an issue with it because it's a rural area or not a very large well-developed infrastructure, everyone has a cell phone there, so they utilize cell phones to report issues that there are with any of the, in this specific instance, the pumps. So this Tarifa group is working in conjunction with the government in Tanzania to help out with the water problem. Now, how they're doing this, or what the end result of all this is, all the info is getting forwarded into a dashboard. Here's like a little clip shot of one. Down here is all the levels or all the variables that are being captured within this dashboard, and these are the ones that we're going to use. We'll get into that in a little bit here. The actual site, you see this is dashboard.tarifa.org, is live, and this is looking at it right now. Right here, this is Tanzania, and we have a showing of where the various pumps are and their current status. Color coded here, not functional, needs repair, functional, and there's all sorts of other sorts of things here, bad stack graphs and some pie charts and that. We can get a sense of where these are distributed throughout the land here. Also, they have, if you go over here, additional info describing the various problems, and again more bar charts and all that. So anyhow, this is where the info is being accumulated, and this is what we're using for our project. So a few miscellaneous items here. I'm using Python for this project, and I'm specifically using the Jupyter Notebook, which is an Anaconda product here. You'll see that in a second. So the process of how I did this, well, I'm just going to go straight to the notebook and kind of walk through a few things there. I think that'll be the best way to do it. So here's our first notebook that I have. This first section is all about dealing with the data here. What I first did was grab all the different files that were given to us, what they call the train test and the train labels, merged everything together, and put everything all in one file to do all my data munging on. I mentioned this was an imbalanced data set, and here's our target variable, functional, not functional, and functional needs repair status of the pumps. You can see the relative proportions of them here. They break down to about 54% are functional, 38% non-functional, and then the balance a little over 7% functional yet needs repair. Going down, you see with all the variables here, I took account of all the unique values per. There's about 74,250 total records here, and some of these here, they're small. You know, there's 9 basin here. There are 7 entries under the class of the extraction type, but some of them are a couple thousand. Sub-village 21,000, scheme name 2,000. So there's a lot of entries under some of these variables which can be problematic. We'll get into that in a moment here. So going through some of the variables briefly, I won't bore you to death too much, at least I hope not. The first one, amount TSH, which is the total static head. It's a pressure measurement of how much production each pump has. I thought, okay, a box plot will look nice to see how each of the various statuses are represented here. Well, this is one of the most sorry looking box plots you'll ever see. And why is that? If you do a distribution plot, look at all this propensity of zeros here. So there obviously was a data entry problem here. If you break it down here, there's 52,000 entries that are zero, and the others are somewhat distributed elsewhere. More realistic numbers what probably are. So obviously that's a data problem. If doing a pivot table here, combining things here, here's our total static head is 0, and here how it breaks down with how many of the various levels, functional needs repair, etc. This here is a bar graph count plot actually in the Seaborn, which is a really nice way of visualizing it. Other levels will look better. You can see the large number of zeros here, which obviously are a problem. One thing I originally did was I tried to recode a lot of these, trying to use a little inference here, thinking, okay, the thing is functional, there's no way that the static head could be 0. It has to be something else. So I coded it to something else like the mean or the median. But the other is non-functional, functional needs repair. I don't know, I couldn't say that it, well actually the functional needs repair probably was not 0 because if it was working, it was generating water. But would it truly be the median or the mean like the other one, or would it be something less? Well, maybe. And non-functional, it could be something greater than 0. We don't know why the pump was non-functional. So, you know, I was guessing a lot. And what I found out when I was doing a lot of the modeling, that when I was doing all this, the predictive value, the value of this variable went way down. So eventually what I ended up doing was I just said, you know what, I'm just going to leave this as is here with 2 small exceptions. First off, I put a cap on the values at 5,000. That's equivalent to the 99th percentile here. So that's somewhere right around here on this graph. If you look at it, it's semi-normal. It's somewhat dome bell shaped right here. If I capped it at the what roughly is the right end or the bottom end of the thing, okay, maybe it'll look a little bit better. One thing to note here, look at this. The mean of this distribution is 318 and the standard deviation is 2900. So yeah, it's pretty ugly. The only other thing I did was over here, I placed a flag variable. It said anytime that the amount TSH was 0, I created a unique value in the data frame here saying that was a 1. So here's, look at this with a second value here, that value is 0. So it's still 0 there, but this flag variable is now 1. So hoping that sometimes that makes a little added level of prediction, doing that with problem variables. Moving on, here's basin. This is a geographic measurement. You see all these different areas here and the general breakdown of the pump status. Most of them tend to follow the typical breakdown, mostly functional, somewhere about less than that, non-functional, and the very little functional needs repair. Though there are a few exceptions. See the southern coast here and Lake Rocroi follow a slightly different breakdown, but you know, it's possible that a location would have some sort of predictive value here given these differing proportions in those regions there. At the very least, those regions may hold some unique value relative to the others. Construction year, again, a large number of zeros. There's a lot of bad data entry here, but thinking about a construction year, it's just a number. It doesn't mean a whole lot. So what I ended up doing was I ended up binning all these into decades here. So 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, etc. And one thing to note, 60s, 70s, 80s, which would indicate the older the pumps, those are more so non-functional. It's an interesting occurrence there. There's another one, date recorded. This I ended up taking the two extreme, or the one extreme at the latest date, December 3rd, 2013, and subtracting the other dates from that to getting a measure of days since it was recorded, trying to get a measure of age of the pumps. And this is what the distribution ended up being, very bimodal looking. District code is another geographic one. No idea what codes are, but I left it as is, and it'll be determined if I want to keep that variable later on. Here, there's a lot of variables here that end up having this case here, describing very much the same thing with multiple variables. For example, extraction type class, extraction type group. If you look at all of these, they all have similar, if not identical, categories or different breakdowns with them. Some have more, some have less, some are more granular. It really varies. So often what I did was you look at all of them, take one as being what you're going to run with, and you drop the rest, because that's obviously redundant info. You're not going to get anything more, or it'll like be problematic if you put two of these in a model. So that's generally what I did with all of those. Now this is going funder here. This is the case, describing the case of where we had a lot of those values, or a significant number of values per variable, per column. The government of Tanzania was the one that funded most of these here, and there's a couple of, thousands, several hundred here, but there's a whole lot of one-off guys here. There's also a lot of null values in this column here. So what he ended up doing was, there was a handful of variables that were just like this: funder, installer, all these listed right here. I also set something called a threshold of 300. So what I did with all these variables here, with all these numerous levels inside them, first off, I changed the nulls and code them as unknown. And then right here is what I did was I took that threshold value and I said anything with the total count of them is 300 or above, I kept. If it was anything below 300, it was recoded to other. And so here you can see what some of them here at funder. Here's one is other. There's one that was also zero, a lot of zeros here. A hero zero, very common thing in this data. That was coded to unknown there to deal with that. And then as we go right here to look at some of those after I put that threshold cut off. Installer 308 and up, everything else is other. WPT name, water point name, a whole bunch of them are other. The frequent occurring guys are all right here. GPS height. There's a lot of zero values here, which probably is not right. Although, doing a little research here, I found that the typical elevation in Tanzania, these numbers here are not terribly off. It is around sea level to a bit above. So the zero value is not necessarily wrong, but just the propensity of them probably is. There were two other variables here. I'll try to get through some of this. Latitude and longitude, which had similar sorts of cases where a handful of numbers that didn't make sense. You could go look and find out exactly where the latitude and longitude extends, and then also a bit of the elevations of the land there of Tanzania, and you can tell what's a good number and what's a bad number. What I ended up doing was grouping everything by basin, by that category I mentioned earlier. So this is grouping everything by basin and taking the mean of all the values in that group: latitude, longitude, and GPS height. First, I took everything that was within what I call the good values. Took those, what would be outliers or bad entries, a lot of those zeros, a lot of those other bad values of latitude and longitude. That's what these means here represent. So I took anything outside of that good area here, I call it the boundary data frame. Anything outside that boundary data frame got imputed with these mean values here. So I imputed with the mean, but it was kind of a smarter mean. And here's what GPS height ended up being. Looks a little bit better, probably a more realistic depiction, whereas here's what it was initially with all these zeros here. The majority of the rest of these things are what I was talking about earlier about the redundant variables. So you pick, you go through the two or three, see if there's any null values, and if there's a good one, or pick one as your good one and you run with it. The only other thing outside of that was this population variable. I didn't end up changing anything with that because there's a lot of one values here which seem to be odd, or single occurrences and all that, but a lot of 0 and 1 indicated populations which seem off, but I didn't have any good info to do any imputation with it, so I ended up creating another flag variable, population 0 and population 1. And then the balance was that just picking, eliminating redundant variables, and then moving on. The next thing briefly I did in this other notebook, the one thing of note I did this was where I was going to do some of the processing on the data here. The big thing of note here is I used the standard scaler and I standardized all the continuous variables here. So for example, here's a listing of all the variables here, latitude, longitude, all that. I standardized to put them on a more even manageable scale. I originally did some one-hot encoding in here, but I changed that to do that with the where it was dealing with the models, because I was doing a lot of changing of adding and subtracting variables. So I decided to take it out of here and just do that specifically in the model portions. Speaking of models, I'll run through one really quick, which is kind of a typical one to indicate what I did. First off, here was importing all that data I did with all the lunge data as well as standardized data. I then here chose what variables I was going to keep. This was a very much influx kind of spot here in the notebooks here. I would add one, take one out. So it was a constant iterative sort of thing here. Defined every called it dummy cols, which is the dummy variables, or the categorical variables rather. And then what I did was I ran the PD get dummies, which is one hot encoding everything. Rearranged the data frame so the ID was first and the target value was last, and this is what I ended up coming up with. ID was first. Here's my standardized data here, and over here a lot of those zeros and ones for the one hot encoded, and over here my target variable status group. Here I did a lot of the slicing to set up my X and Y. Here's what I ended up with, a brief example for what X would be. Sliced away the ID because that's not a predictive thing, and I got rid of the target value, target variable there, because this is the test one here. Did this train test split, which is a nice function in Python. So I put everything in a train set and a validation set to do a little quickie checks on my models. And here's the actual model generation here. This one here is the extra tree classifier. It's just an ensemble of trees, which I found it's kind of an uncommon one, but I found had pretty good luck with it in the past. Here we define the base model here without any characteristics, any parameters. We use all the default settings. I just indicate a random state here. People that program in R would know this as the seed. Set a level of parameters. So for all these various parameters in the model, I gave a range or a couple of values of what they could be, of what I wanted to test. You then run the command grid search CV or grid search cross validation. You tell the base model here, and then all these parameters. So it runs through every single one. So it goes 500 non-estimators, 2 samples, 2 min-sample split, 5 max features. Then it runs again, 500 estimators, 5 min-sample split, 5 max features, and so on and so forth. And keeps running through it. This can take a while. But after it does get done, what you can do is say, hey, give me your best parameters, and it spits out what it finds are the best parameters here. And this is a best score here of what it ended up coming out with to determine these here. I believe this is like probably the train error here. I then took that, threw it against the validation data set to see what my values would be. So 0.796 so far seems to have merit. Not every process can give you all this data right away, but the general process then is you then start over again. Okay, my extra tree classifier, all these here, all those data here, those are the same as our ideal best parameters up here. So you create a new model using the best parameters, put it on your train set, and here you go. Figure out your score. Look at that, I got a pretty high training accuracy. When we do it against the validation, again 0.796, so that's probably pretty good. Cross validation on 5-fold here to double check. Take the mean of that, 0.795, so we're pretty consistent here. Another thing I did often was called these importance plots. Create a data frame of the various importances that these tree models can export, and this is a graphical form of it saying which one was it considered to be the most important here. Can't figure out how to get this bigger, so it does get kind of bunched up, but printing out the data frame here, you can get the variables and some numbers here associated as to what's good and what's not, or what in the hierarchy of what it uses and what it likes. This is part of the iterative process of going back and forth up there, adding and eliminating variables, trying to find an ideal mix. So then here you do your predict, throw everything to a data frame, and you submit it. And this one here, I got 0.7995 as my rating here for on the test set. And so going back, I ran a handful of models, random forest, gradient boosted, a couple of them. Here's the extra tree. I did a neural net and a couple of extreme gradient boosting. This portion circled here in orange were my results from when I submitted to the website. Didn't quite crack the 0.8 club, but I was pretty consistent, 0.78, 0.79 across the board with everything here. I guess one other thing of note, check out these validation scores here, as well as the 5-fold cross validation I did on most of them. These values are pretty consistent. So it seemed to work out well. I didn't have anything too weird going on here. And going from these validation numbers to when I actually submitted it on the test data here, it was also pretty consistent, although there was a slight jump up, fortunately, in my test results for all of these. So fairly happy with these here. I guess one brief note, the neural net, I just did the base one. I didn't do any fancy tuning or anything like that. I just didn't quite have the time to do that. I thought I would get better results out of extreme gradient boosting, but I didn't. Maybe there's more tuning that I need to do, but it was consistent with the others. My standings overall, the extra trees, again, was my best one, 0.7995. It puts me at 744 out of all of the entries here. To calculate that out, that's something like, I don't know, top 15%-ish, something like that. And here's a screenshot or clip of the top dogs here with everyone. Top scores are 0.8285. So if you just take the top level, subtract my score from it, you got 0.029, so they're just under 3% better than I am. And if you look at how far down they go, they're going down to 4 decimal places. So, 10 like 10,000ths are separating the top couple here. So it's getting pretty fine. So I'm fairly happy with my scores. I was hoping to get top 10% just as a semi-arbitrary sort of goal, but overall I think I'm pretty happy with what I have here. And that concludes my presentation.